In this video, I'm going to have a look at some paintbrush basics. Hello and welcome everyone to another brushstroke painting guide. So in this video, as you heard from the intro, we're going to be looking at some paintbrushes, and this is really following on from the last couple of fundamental videos I've done in terms of paint thinning and wet palettes. So if you've not had a chance to check those out, then I'll put a link up at the top here and a link in the description below because they're definitely worth checking out. But in terms of this video, what I thought would be quite a good idea is just to cover off some of the basics in terms of brush use, how to load them, how to maintain them while you're painting, a bit about brush control maybe, and then finishing off with just how best to clean and care for your brushes. Now for this video, I'm going to talk specifically about this one type of paintbrush, which is an artist's watercolour brush. Now there are other types and shapes of brushes that we use in miniature painting, and they have different advantages and purposes, but for this basic overview of how brushes work and how you should be using them for painting, I thought it was easier just to stick to the one brush type, and I'll cover the others in later videos. Okay, so let's start right at the beginning and take a look at the different parts that make up a paintbrush and how a paintbrush works. Beginning of course then with the handle, and then on the end of the handle you have the silver part which is called the ferrule, and the ferrule is then used to attach the bristles to the brush. And it's when we get to the bristles that things start to get interesting, because that's where the paintbrush actually does its work. And then there's two areas of the bristles that we're interested in. So the fatter part at the back of the bristles is called the belly, and that's where it holds the majority of the moisture for the brush to work. And then at the point at the very end we call the tip, and that's the bit that you need to be focusing on in terms of applying the paint to the model. So no great shakes there then, that's all pretty standard stuff. But it's when it comes to the bristles that you start to have some decisions that you need to make. Do you want a brush with natural bristles, synthetic bristles, or even a mixture of the two? Is there even a difference? Well, yes, actually there is a difference, and that difference is in terms of the behaviour and the characteristics that each bristle gives. Natural bristles, for example, have a unique shape where they're fatter in the middle and taper both to the base and the tip, which helps them soak up a greater amount of paint and deposit it smoothly. They also have microscopic scales and cavities along each bristle, which makes them very absorbent. It's all these natural characteristics which then add up to make a bristle which is perfect for forming a very sharp tip, and will continue to maintain that sharp tip whilst painting because the natural fibres will have a tendency to snap back to their natural shape. And then the final characteristic of a natural bristle is its strength, which again is thanks to its shape, but also because it's so absorbent, when it's wet it's incredibly strong. And this is magnified all the more when they're tightly packed together as a paintbrush head, which means if they are correctly maintained and cared for, they are incredibly long lasting. So what's the downside, I hear you ask? And unfortunately there is a downside, and that is they can cost a lot of money. Now, especially if you go for the highest quality sable brushes, you will find that compared to other brush types, they are very expensive. But on the plus side, if you maintain them, they will last for years. And I can vouch for that because I am still using brushes which are at least 5 years old. By contrast, synthetic bristles are man-made polyester filaments, which modern technology tries to mimic the characteristics of a natural bristle by making them taper towards the end and including cavities along each bristle to make them as absorbent as possible, and that actually does result in quite a good smooth delivery. But as of yet, they're still to match the performance of a natural bristle. Synthetic bristles also struggle to replicate the natural bristle's ability to spring back and hold a tip, and unfortunately they are prone to the tips splitting and hooking, and with them being polyester they don't respond to the brush soaps and conditioners that a natural fibre does, and as a result they're not as easily saved, so their lifespan does tend to be shorter. All of which though is offset by the fact that they are an awful lot cheaper to buy in the first place. Now, I am very much aware that obviously a lot of what I've just said there is quite subjective, and you need to make your decisions yourselves in terms of what's the best brush for you. So my advice would be, if you are just looking to start painting, then the best thing for you to do is to try as many different types of brushes as you can from as many different brands and find out which one suits you best. Now for me, obviously I do prefer the sable brushes because I find that the paint goes on an awful lot smoother and I can control it, and I like the flex that they have in the bristle. So if you do decide that you are the same, then I can highly recommend the brushes that I use, and I put a link up in the top and in the description below for more details if you want to try those out. Okay then, so let's take a look now at how to load your paintbrush. So you've thinned your paints and you want to start painting onto the model, and you'll be pleased to know there's only really 4 things you need to bear in mind. So the first one is you need to think about how a paintbrush works. So what it does is it stores the moisture in the fatter part of the bristles, which we now know is called the belly, and then when you apply the tip of the bristles to a surface like your model, it transfers that moisture and the paint down through the bristles onto the surface, in a very similar way to how the ink flows through a pen via the nib. And to ensure that that transfer process works as efficiently as possible, it's important to ensure that your paint bristles are damp before loading any paint. And I say damp as a very specific term because you don't want the paintbrush bristles to be affecting the thinness level of the paint that you're loading into the brush. So for example, if the paintbrush was completely dry, actually what would happen is those bristles would try and absorb and suck up moisture out of the paint that you're loading. And conversely, if the paintbrush was completely saturated, so it was soggy with water, then all you'd be doing is thinning the paint down more as you add it to the paintbrush. So the best way to ensure that the paint remains the same as the thin level that you've added on your palette is to make sure that those bristles are just damp without any excess moisture. And the next thing that you want to bear in mind is you don't want to overload your brush when you're adding paint to your paintbrush. So really what you're looking to do is just load up the first 2/3 of your bristles from the tip. And this is to ensure that you don't get too much paint into those bristles and run the risk of getting paint into the furrow. Because if you do, that will actually affect the performance of the paintbrush, and if you do have paint in there that starts to dry, then it will clump the bristles together and you'll find that the tip of the brush will start to split and you won't be able to get a nice point anymore. So definitely something worth avoiding. And on the topic of having a nice sharp tip to your brush, that's the last point that you need to bear in mind, is as you're loading your brush, you want to be twisting and forming that tip at the same time so that you have a lovely sharp tip to start painting with. Okay, so let's have a look at that in practice. So here I have my palette and I've got my water that I'm going to use to thin those paints down on the palette. And in addition to that, I'm going to have another pot of water which I'm going to use to rinse and clean my brush as I paint. Right, I'm going to run down my list then, so starting off with dampening the bristles. And to do this, I'm going to dip it into the water and then I'm going to remove any excess water from the brush on the back of my hand. Now the reason I'm not using tissue to do this is because I don't want to dry the brush, I just want to remove the excess. So this will just take the water out of it but keep those bristles damp, which is obviously what we're aiming for. So now I can start adding paint to my brush by just running the bristles through the paint, remembering to only use those front 2/3 of the bristles and avoid getting any paint into that furrow. And then finally what I'm doing is I'm twisting the brush to make sure that I continue to keep that nice sharp tip, so when I start painting I have a lovely tip to paint with. Which should mean that you end up with a lovely brush to paint with like this. Okay, so I've got my paint and let's do a little bit on brush control. So the key thing for brush control is stability, and you can get that stability by working with the joints of your fingers. So hang on, let me just put my brush down. To explain, so your finger is hinged and it moves in that direction, okay? And that's where it's most stable and you have the most fine motor control. So that's the movement that you should be taking advantage of to get maximum control for when you're painting. So by holding the paintbrush low and then using that movement to pull the brush back towards your palm gives you that control. And then you need to combine that with a stable platform, so elbows on the desk, and then you make a contact point between your hands. Now that can be anything from just a finger to putting your wrists together, maybe even tucking your elbows in to give you that stability. But even just having a light finger contact between the two hands is enough to give you that extra bit of stability and control. So if you keep that contact point with the thing that you're painting, you'll keep that control. And that's what will allow you to paint clean and smooth brushstrokes. But don't forget that control is limited to the direction of your finger bend, so you will need to turn the model to match the direction of the brushstroke you want. And when it comes to applying those brushstrokes, you want to let the brush do all the work. So you want to be applying just the smallest amount of pressure to let the paint flow from the brush. You don't need to be applying any heavy pressure or pushing hard, because the paint is already nice and thin and it will flow just like an ink from a pen. And by having that light contact will allow you to apply a nice even coverage across the whole of the brushstroke. Now there is one area of using a paintbrush which is really important but never really seems to get mentioned, and that's maintaining your paintbrush as you're using it. So what I mean by that is, while you're using your paintbrush and you're loading up paint into those bristles, that paint is constantly trying to dry, and if you're not conscious of this, then you could let paint dry in those bristles or on the tip, and that will reduce the effectiveness of the paintbrush itself. But more worryingly, that dry paint could come away and get onto your model, ruining your paint job. Far better then just to get into the habit of regularly rinsing and cleaning those bristles between loading your paintbrush, just to ensure that that build-up of paint can't happen and you don't have any of those problems. All I do then as part of my routine is give it a rinse in the water and a quick wipe on the side of the beaker just to loosen any paint in those fibres, and then taking just a piece of tissue, I'll draw the paintbrush back and twist the bristles just to loosen any thickening paint that might be in those bristles and draw them out. And then it's a case of repeating your paint loading process. So dunk it in the water, remove any excess and start to load the paintbrush. Not forgetting, of course, to twist your brush as you're loading that paint, just to make sure you get a nice sharp tip to your brush. Okay, so that brings us on to the last topic now for this video, and that's going to be how to clean your brushes. So in this video I've mentioned that it's good practice to get into the habit of regularly rinsing and cleaning your brushes as you're using them, and I have mentioned that it's advisable not to get paint into the furrow, because that is the #1 cause for the paintbrush tip to split. But this is the real world and mistakes do happen, so I thought I'd show a few steps of how I clean my brushes pretty much after every paint session, but I'll be honest, sometimes it's the next day, and how you can get that dried paint out of a bristle and make your paintbrushes like new. Okay, so here's an example of a brush that I used for a paint session and obviously didn't get around to cleaning, so it's looking quite sorry for itself. It's lost its sharp tip and it's clearly got paint still left in it, so let's see if we can clean this up. And the first thing I'm going to need actually comes in the box sets of brushes that you get from Artist Opus, but you can buy it separately obviously, and that's this little guy here. And this is brush soap, and this is going to solve all of my problems. Now, if you've never used a brush soap before, don't worry, it's dead easy to use and it's designed for getting dried paint and crud out of the bristles and even out of the furrow of your paintbrushes and restoring that tip. And in addition to the soap, you will also need some clean water and some paper towel. Okay then, so what do we do? So the first thing you do is you just get a drop of water and you add that to your soap. And I'm going to get my brush and, okay, right, don't drop it because that doesn't really help. I'm going to get my brush and then I'm just going to start rubbing that into the wet soap and start to build up a bit of a lather. And as you can see, that paint is already starting to come out of those bristles. So all I'm doing is I'm continuing to work that soap into those bristles and actually draw it up even past the furrow, just to try and get as much soap into those bristles as possible. And then I'm going to use the soft part of the palm of my hand and I'm going to start drawing out that paint. Hang on, is this still in focus? Right, yeah, okay, that's a bit better. Okay, so what I was saying is I'm going to use the soft part of the palm of my hand and I'm going to draw the paintbrush back whilst twisting it. And I'm going to use that flow action of the brush with the soapy water to now lift out that paint and draw it out onto the palm of my hand. Now it's really important that you just pull the brush back in this one direction, which is obviously the same direction that you would be using if you were painting onto the model, because you want the paint to come off the bristles through the tip and not force it back up into the furrow. Now when the paintbrush is dry, it's time to give it a good rinse out in the water, and then you can wipe that off onto the paper towel. And this is where you get a check to see how the bristles are looking. Are they looking dirty? Do you need to add any more? Maybe just give it another quick little rinse out. Keep checking out those bristles, see what the dirt levels are. And then if necessary, you can go back and you can repeat the process again. So just grab your brush soap and then gently start to work those bristles back into that wet soap, and then really start to build up that lather in between the bristles. And then it's just a case of drawing that wet soap back out onto the palm of your hand. Now I use the palm of my hand because it's a very forgiving surface. It's obviously quite spongy and it won't run the risk of damaging the brush in any way. It's not abrasive. It just seems to be the best method that I've found, and it also means that you can keep a good track of how much dirt is coming off the brush. Right, that's actually looking pretty good now, so I'm just going to give it another quick rinse and just check on the paper towel if there's any paint left in those bristles. Nope, that's looking good. So now it's just a case of giving it a little bit of a twist just to form that tip. And that brush is nice and clean. And that's all there is to it. So really, depending on how dirty the brushes are, will just determine how many cycles you need to do, but just keep working through until it's perfectly clean. One last word in terms of brush storage, it's always advisable to keep your brushes flat, so lie them down, or if you can, hang them so your bristles point down. It's really not advisable to have them pointing up, because that can affect the bristles and the tip can curl. So if you have a brush set, then keep them in the box, or maybe look at getting a paintbrush rack. Okay, that's it for this video. I really hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching. If you have enjoyed it, then please do give it a like. And if you'd like to see more of these videos, then please drop a comment below and let me know what you'd like to see. If you have enjoyed this video, then please do consider hitting that subscribe button and supporting the channel. And don't forget to click the notification bell to be told whenever I post another video. And finally, I'd love it if you stayed on the channel and checked out some more of my videos. So if you haven't already done so, I highly recommend that you check out my paint thinning video. Or how about my latest painting video, where you can see all of these techniques being put to good use.